Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the Managrind tournament recap, featuring the top decks, featuring the top cards, and the state of the metagame for this week's tournament. So, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Top 4 from NA, we had Confused, Managrind Spo, Managrind Reels, and Shamus. Now, moving on to Confused, who's playing a Ledendary Enrage deck. This is similar to the one from last week, where it was sort of a base Legendary Warrior deck with some early Enrage cards. Now, if we actually look at the deck, we have things like Acolyte Pain, Frothing Berserker, Armor Smith, Cruel Taskmaster, the Enrage Engine. This allows you to get some card draw early, get some extra armor and defense, an extra threat on the board in case of Frothing Berserker, which is actually very difficult to deal with at 4 life. The only notable removal that really hits it is Swipe and Eviscerate, but they have to combo and Eviscerate. So it's very difficult to remove at 4 life. It dodges things like Wrath and Spell Power Backstab and Lightning Bolts and Rock Biters and things like that. It dodges a lot of stuff. Very solid early game threat. The actual legendaries in this particular deck, we've got Grom, Ragnaros as finishers, along with Ysera for the sustained late game against other control decks. We also have the Sylvanas Windrunner and Cairn to hold down the mid game. Most of these decks play 2 6-drops. You can always side in Black Knight in these kinds of tournaments, so often you don't need to have that in your main deck. Sometimes you do though, but often you don't. Cairn is just one of the best 6-drops in the game at the moment, and Sylvanas is always powerful with that effect. Now, the actual spells and removal, we've got 1 mandatory brawl, we've got the shield slams, and the slams and shield blocks and whirlwind, some pretty standard removal. Whirlwind is a bit of one which a lot of people don't run, but in this kind of deck where you want to enrage your own stuff, it's very useful. It also synergizes well with Execute, and you can use like Armor Smiths to run into big things and then execute them. Now, the deck also runs 2 Fiery War Axes, which I feel is almost mandatory. It's good at dealing with early game aggro, and it's good at dealing with the last couple points of damage that you really need to do to finish someone off. It's a very good weapon, one of the best early weapons in the game. Now, on to Spo, who is the Managrind NA team leader, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Spo was playing a Druid beatdown deck. Spo has been playing Druid for months. And months and months and months. He played Druid when people did not play Druid. That is how long he's been playing Druid. But anyway, he brought a Druid beatdown deck here. Now, I've talked about this deck so much that I am going to just talk about what the interesting techs are, and I am going to leave it alone because there's another more interesting Druid deck coming up. But yeah, I've talked about Druid beatdown to death. Just go on any of my previous weekly shows that have been recent, and I also did a couple of tournament recaps on it, and it's everywhere. You have to talk about it all the time, so I'm just gonna skim over it. So, legendary wise, we have the standard Cairn, Nap Hagel, Blood Mage Thalnos. We've got late game and Ragnaros, which is sometimes taken out because of Big Game Hunter, but in this case you really want to run it as a finisher. We also have the Cenarius, which buffs up your earlier stuff since you're playing things like Chillwind Yetis, Harvest Golem, Sunfury Protectors. You get off your really early minions so that you can get the massive boost with Cenarius. It's also running Tinkmaster to deal with other big legendaries, Faceless Manipulator to replicate your own stuff or replicate your opponent's stuff and then kill it, standard Keeper of the Groves. Now the actual spells, the interesting bit here, we've got a Claw, which a lot of people don't like, but it works as a one-off in this kind of deck. Claw gives you a bit of extra life, it helps deal with some early stuff like Fairy Dragon or Knife Jugglers, things like that. And then we also have Force of Nature Savage Roar. Now, Force of Nature Savage Roar is a 14 damage combo if you get it off on turn 9. If you have anything else on the board, it adds another 2 damage to the combo along with their attack. Gives you a lot of reach, a lot of burst damage, and also allows you to smash through some really big taunts if you've got the entire combo in your hand. Now, moving on to 3rd/4th, we've got Reels, who also made top 4 last week with a pretty similar deck, almost the same concept-wise. Now, this deck, I talked about it last week, but I'll quickly go over it. It's a Cantrip deck. Well, it's derived from a Cantrip deck. It does play a lot of the Cantrip stuff, but instead of playing a early game tempo based gameplay style with more mid game focus. It does play some of the later stuff like Ragnaros and Gadget Zan and some of the really late game cards. However, this version has been updated a bit, so we've got the Luke Hoarder in there, we've got Blood Cell Raiders to get some power off from deadly poisons. SI7s are still in here, we've got Double Defender, a lot of early game, but not sort of game ending early game, just to stabilize. Now, for the spells, we've got a lot of spells. This is way more spells than normal for these kinds of decks. 2 Assassinates, 2 Saps, 2 Shivs. That's twice as many spells as normal for these kinds of decks. Now, the 2 Shivs are kind of like Novice Engineers in spell form, and if you have enough spell power, which he does, then you can get it to really function. He's got 3 spell power, he's got a Gadget Zan, it really works well with Shiv. Now, the Assassinates have been replacing the Black Knight equivalent in this deck because a lot of people have been dropping taunts, so getting the Assassinates is sometimes better than getting off the taunts. Another interesting one about this deck is that Silence was taken out. We've still got the Tinkmaster to deal with really annoying stuff like Karen, but you've got to keep in mind, in this kind of tournament, you can always side in Silences. It's not like Ladder, where you just have to make do with what you've got. If you're in a matchup that requires you to have a lot of Silences, you side them in. Sap also functions as a pseudo-silence by tempoing your opponent out. On to Seamus, who rounds out our top 4, playing a Druid beatdown deck. I've already talked about this to the T. Now, the interesting ones about this, we've got Big Game Hunter, and no Cenarius, and no Claw, compared to Spo's deck, I mean. In favor of running things like Black Knight and a couple of extra 2-ofs. There's not much for me to talk about, to be honest. I've already talked about this deck. It's successful, it's the best deck in the format. I'm not brushing over it because I don't like the deck, I'm brushing over it because I've talked about it so much. So we're going to move on, but the deck is good. Anyway, top 4 for EU, we had Rage, KHF, I think. Rage. Everyone calls him Rage. Anyway, we had Rage. We had Mr. Moon, also known as the German or TLO. He comes on to my channel and stream a lot. I do any of my extra projects with Moon generally, and I interact with him. And he's the team captain of the EU Managrind team. And yeah, most of you guys will know him. He even made a quick cameo in the last weekly, things like that. And then we had Japiapan in 3rd/4th, and we had Random also in 3rd/4th, which is very random. That was a bad joke, whatever. Anyway, on to Rage's Shaman Midrange with OTK. It's Shaman Midrange OTK, it's a Shaman Midrange deck playing the OTK combo with Wind Fury, Rockbiter Weapon, Leroy, and Flame Tongue Totems. First things first, this dethroned Druid. Now, in EU, Druid has won every single open tournament in the past 5 weeks. This dethroned it. Like, that's incredibly impressive. I mean, Druid still took half the top 4 and then half the NA top 4, but it still managed to win through all these Druids, which is very impressive. Anyway, on to the actual deck. We've got Nat Pagal, Blood Mage for draw and spell power as usual. Leroy Jenkins for the combo later on in the game, which can do 18 damage or more, usually 18. Then we've got Ysera as a late game grind fest against control decks that just refuse to die, things like Warriors. Azure Drakes, Defender of Argus, Gadget Zan, standard mid game draw, and just value out of the Defender of Argus. Only playing 1 because having 2 in your hand is a bit awkward at times. Unbound Elemental is a massive threat that some people just can't deal with. Again, only running 1 because it's only effective against some decks. Sometimes against Druid it just goes swiped, for example, if you don't get the instant overload on it. Chillwind Yetis dodge most of the removal, that's why they're so popular nowadays. It's a very interesting card, and it's a kind of a metagame card. Against things like Senjin, it's horrible, because it still trades with them. But Senjin isn't very popular at the moment. And what is popular? Druids. What does Chillwind Yeti not die to? Swipe. What does it not die to? Eviscerate. It's just very good, and you can't kill it on turn 4 very easily, because you can't just hero power it. The only exception is probably with Rogue, where you can dagger on the previous turn and then combo and eviscerate on it on turn 4, but then you're taking 4 damage. It's just a good card at the moment. Double Fire Elemental. Fire Elemental is one of the most powerful cards in the Shaman deck, and it's one of the main reasons to play the class. It's one of the best 6-drops in the game. It just kills something, and then usually has to be removed with 1 or 2 minions. It's just a huge card swing. Now, as for the actual spells, it's one of the interesting things about Shaman decks. They play a lot of spells. We have a Fork Lightning and 2 Lightning Storms for AoE. We've got Feral Spirits for early game control. It's a spell, but it functions as a minion, but it turns on your gadgets and it's just good. Very, very powerful. Summoning 2/2/3s for 3 mana is extremely good. We also have the Lightning Bolts and Rockbiter weapons. This plays all 4, but 4 Rockbiters most of the time will be for the OTK combo. So you don't tend to want to run these out early as removal. You want to run out your Lightning Bolts, but it's good to play all 4. And then it's also got the 2 Hexes to deal with anything large. It also functions as pseudo silence. 2 Earth Shocks, another silence, has 4 ways of silencing. And lastly, we've got the 2 Wind Fury to help out that Leroy Jenkins combo. So every time you draw the Leroy, you would usually have the combo. Lastly, we've got the 1 Stormforge Axe, which sort of functions as a sort of 4th copy. Fifth copy of Lightning Bolt. It's weird. There's so many Lightning Bolts, but it also has Overload on it, which is fairly relevant. Anyway, very interesting deck. It's good to see Shaman coming back a bit recently. It's one of the decks I predicted would be quite strong, and it's taken a couple of weeks for people to really figure it out, and it seems to be working really well. Now, onto Moon's deck. Well, it's Dark's deck. I'll explain. Okay, so this deck was designed by another Managrind EU member called Dark Onyx, and the deck in the past has done very, very well in top deck tournaments, and Moon actually played the deck along with a Strife Crow variant of Druid, or Beatdown, or whatever you want to call it, to the top deck tournament yesterday, and he ended up winning that, and then came second, mainly focusing on Dark Onyx's Druid deck, but sometimes on Strife Crows. Now, I put it down here as Dark's Druid. The main reason for it is the deck is quite unique. Strife Crow is credited a lot for what he innovated in Druid. A lot of people nowadays have been calling it just Druid Beatdown or Druid Late Game, and the main reason for that is because the deck has been around so long, people have come up with names for it. But in this case, this is a very, very new deck that a lot of people haven't seen before. So I'm just calling it by the person who came up with it. Eventually, it's going to get a name that people like and that's popular, and that's going to become what it is. But until then, I'm just going to call it Dark's Druid. Everyone's going to know what that is. And yeah, so anyway, on to the actual deck. Now, first thing you notice is the legendaries it plays in it are pretty standard. You've got the Karen, Bloodmage Thalanos, Cenarius, because there's a lot of things to buff in this deck. Nat Pagels, Sylvanas, Black Knight, Tank Master, pretty standard. Ancient of Lores, Big Game Hunter, pretty standard. Harvest Golems, things like that, this is all normal. Spells, we've got the standard swipes and innervates, but this is when the similarities end. We've got double claw instead of double wrath, which is more of sort of a sideboard thing, because double claw can function as a defensive boost against some of these life game decks, especially when the deck is more focused on early game attacking as opposed to card advantage. Claw is slightly more powerful than Wrath, just because of the life gain on it. But Wrath is also something you can sideboard in instead of the Claws. They're interchangeable. The other 2 spells here are Starfall and Starfire. Starfall we've seen as a one-off every so often as a tech. Starfire not so much. Starfire answers Shamans very well. It deals with Fire Elementals, Unbound Elementals, helps bring down Earth Elementals, things like that. It's just very, very good. It also helps a lot with Rogues, deals with most of their big stuff. Against Druids, it hits into Cairn, Sylvanas. It just kills a lot of important things in the metagame right now, played by a lot of the bigger decks. But anyway, the real interesting part about this deck is the set of 2-ofs at the bottom. We've got Ancient Watcher, Defender of Argus. You think, wait a second, this is like the beginning of a Shields Up engine. No. Keeper of the Groves, Spellbreakers. This is the core of the deck. The deck has a bit of a Ancient Watcher silence thing, where in most decks play Ancient Watcher, you see them getting taunt. In this particular version, it's a core element of early game aggro. Ancient Watcher on turn 1 with coin into Innervate, Spellbreaker, or Keeper of the Grove gives you a Chillwind Deity attacking on turn 2. That's a huge amount of aggression. It's so difficult for them to shut that down. A turn 2 Chillwind Deity is good. A turn 2 Chillwind Deity along with a 4/3 that is attacking on turn 2 is scary. Now obviously that's one of the best draws the deck can get, but the point is it is possible, and I have seen it several times, having seen people run this. The other thing is innervating out any silences. It also lets you, if you have 4 silences, you get to throw them around. 4 silences and a Tinkmaster. Get rid of any effects you want to. You have 5 silence outlets. By all means, do what you want to with these things. The deck doesn't get silences cloaked in its hand as much because it has a lot of targets. Even its own stuff gets targeted. You've got Ancient Watchers and anything your opponent plays, and there's so many devastating effects right now that everything you silence tends to be beneficial. So that's sort of where the core of the deck lies. It's in the early game as opposed to in the mid to late game, where this is more of an early mid game where the stronger start it gets tends to be earlier, but it can round out into late game with things like the Black Knight and Cairn and things. But if you notice, the 9-drop of choice, first things first, not playing Ragnaros, but the 9-drop of choice is Cairn. Well, the 9-drop of choice to follow up the Cairn, so to speak, words, is Cenarius. Now, most people pick Ysera for this. Cenarius is always a bit of a contestant with Ysera. Some people play Cenarius, some people play Ysera. Some people play both, but it's seen as a bit greedy. The reason this deck plays Cenarius over Ysera is because the buffs are incredible if you get them on Ancient Watchers. If you get a buff on an Ancient Watcher that's already been silenced, you end up with a 6/7, plus whatever silenced it, and any Harvest Golems, Druid Claws. Just 2 targets is all you need. The other thing is the Treant's not that bad in this particular deck because you're continuously clearing your board, so it'll absorb 2 or 3 hits. It's a very interesting deck. I do expect it to come up more in the future, and it's interesting to see an innovation in the sort of Druid playing. Not to be confused with Innervate. Anyway, on to 3rd/4th place, we have a Shaman Midrange deck from Japan. Now, this is a very different list to the OTK list we saw earlier. Now, this one isn't focused on OTK at all. It has no OTK pieces. It's still playing the Hexes, Lightning Bolts, Earthshock, Lightning Storm, Feral Spirits, not playing Rock Biters and Wind Furies because it doesn't need to, not playing a Fork Lightning because it doesn't want to get greedy with its mana, especially when you're playing double Unbound Elementals. You really want to get those out to get the overloads on them, not overloading yourself too much. It's a bit counterintuitive because many people would think that you want as many overloads as possible. You don't need as many overloads as possible to run Unbound Elemental. You need just enough. This particular deck is running 2 Unbound Elementals on 7 overload, well, spells, 6 overload spells, 1 overload weapon, and that seems to be enough for consistency. But anyway, onto the actual minions. We have Bloodmage Thalanos, Cairn, Nat Pagel. This is all standard. We've got Defender Vargas, pretty standard. Azure Drakes are very, very good as a 5-drop now, especially since Sylvanas dropped off the face of the map as a 5-drop and is now 6 mana. We have Earthenring Farseers because Shamans have major issues when it comes to sustain. Mana-Tide Totem functions as a sort of acolyte of pain of sorts. Harvest Golem and Unbound Elemental hold down the mid-game, the early mid-game, whereas the mid to late game transition is held down by Chillwind Deities and Fire Elementals, and a Boulder Fist Ogre. This is an interesting one. Now, Boulder Fist Ogre doesn't die to anything. And I'm actually serious, it doesn't die to anything. It will die to a fully traded Cairn. Okay. It will die to a Ysera if they both attack each other. Sure. But it will then kill the Ysera and the Cairn. It does die to Ragnaros, and Ragnaros is one of the best counters to this thing because if you get a Ragnaros hit on it, it can't counterattack, it's just going to die. But it's a very underestimated card. I do appreciate it as a one-off. I would never run 2. It conflicts a lot when it comes to 6-drops, but it's definitely an interesting card to run and to see how it works overall. Now, the last deck we're going to talk about is another Druid from Random. It's amazing how many Druids came today. Anyway, this is a Druid beatdown deck, or a Strife Crow-esque. And I have almost nothing to talk about. The spells are more to do with Spo's lineup, so he's playing the one of Claw as well. The actual minions, we see the Ragnaros for late game. The interesting thing is he's not playing a Zero or Cenarius, he's just leaving the 9 mana slot open because he does have the Ancient Lures and Faceless and things. He doesn't need that many high cost. He's running really high heavy anyway. Double Sunfury Protectors, Keeper of the Groves, Harvest Golems, Chomas. This is all pretty standard. The actual deck is almost identical to the two we saw in NA, and also the second variant that Moon was running that I didn't decide to go over because there's no point. All those decks, I'll put the links to them in the description as usual. I'll put the links to the articles up on Hearthbone. You can go check out the deck list yourself. But to be honest, there's not much I can talk about when it comes to Druid anymore. Everyone knows everything about Druid. It's the best deck in the format. It wins the most. It is the most consistent. It's doing the best on ladder. All the lists are pretty similar. There's not much for me to talk about. So yeah, most of the shows with a lot of Druids in them will probably be shorter, because I just don't have anything to talk about, unless something like Dark's Druid deck comes up. So anyway, thank you all for watching. This has been Jotto. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. If you put a comment on any of my videos recently and I haven't responded, it's because Google Plus has been messing up and I'm not getting comments. I have to go and check each one of my videos manually. So yeah, I will be checking my videos manually, but if you don't get a response within a day and it's a question, then I just haven't got to it yet, and I'll see what I can do. But anyway, this has been Jotto, signing off.